I'm in college, and so I've been to a lot of campus ministries, and by far the most overused word there is the word community. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where I build this big church in Minecraft while I talk about Christianity. And don't worry, this is not the church, this is just a nice little space I've built underneath the church where my bed is. But yeah, so the church itself is up here, and yeah, I'm going to be working on it as I always do. And I'm going to be talking about this idea of community, why A, it's important, why B, it's often talked about in the wrong ways, and C, why it can become an idol, and often does become an idol in some churches. The way I structured that, I sounded like I was giving a sermon. I'm not giving a sermon. Because I'm not a preacher, I'm not going to pretend that I'm qualified to give sermons. I just know how to give thoughts, and my words should by no means be substituted for, going to church. Like, listening to Christian YouTube videos is for edification, not for a spiritual ritual, and it shouldn't be that. And that kind of ties into what I'm saying about a lot of these campus ministries, because I'm a college student, and there are a lot of campus ministries that do great work. They often do influence people to become Christians, to come to Christ. So I'm thinking like InterVarsity and Crew, or maybe Young Life, and some of them are better than others. But they all have the goal of making people come to Christ. That's good. But the problem is when they focus too much on community, and when they see themselves as kind of a substitute for an actual church service. So what often happens is, first of all, they'll do their worship services. They'll have a kind of quasi-worship services, which I think are frankly horrible. Obviously, that's my own opinion. But of course, it's always a contemporary worship style, and it basically isn't too different from the type of worship you'll see at a lot of these very contemporary non-denominational churches. And as if you have not already figured out, I am not a fan of that style of worship. But yeah, that's kind of what's going to happen if you go to your average campus ministry. And one of those those styles of worship are basically, I've heard it described as a concert and a TED Talk, and that's extremely accurate. It really is. You sing a few, cringy contemporary hymns, and then there's sort of a talk about something. Maybe it's usually related to Christianity or to faith or to the Bible, but maybe kind of just, if it is related, only vaguely so. And even if sometimes I don't want to say it's all bad, sometimes it is a really good message. But I don't like when that is substituted for formal worship, because there's a difference between our everyday lowercase w worship, because we should worship God all the time, and our weekly Sunday uppercase W formal Sabbath day worship. So there, and this reminds me of one time I listened to a pastor say and talk about this story of nuns asking their mother, like the lead nun, is it okay to smoke while praying? And she said, no, absolutely not. You need to be completely focused when you're praying. But then the next day they worded it differently. They said, is it okay to pray while smoking? And the nun was like, yes, of course, it's always okay to pray. So the point there is, there's never a time when we shouldn't worship, when we're not supposed to worship. We're supposed to worship God unceasingly. But when we should still set aside time for formal worship. That means we should not really be doing other things. So there's formal worship, there's informal worship, and I think we shouldn't conflate the two. So the problem with when these college ministries see their sort of worship as just the worship. People sometimes in college won't really feel the need to go to church because they're like, well, I go to my, weekly Thursday night worship at my college ministry. But there's a difference. And the other problem that's sort of the point of this video is also in those types of environments, I feel like community, this idea of community, becomes the end-all be-all for groups like this. So that's why I say the most overused word I hear in these groups is the word community. It's like, hey man, we're like a community. The community is so important. Yes, it is important. But when the purpose of our worship becomes a community, then church becomes a social club. And I've seen a lot of churches be completely destroyed by that, because what will happen anytime you put too much social value on something, it becomes a clique. There becomes social hierarchies begin to form. That's what always happens. And of course, churches and ministries will try to be welcoming to everyone, but what always happens when there's too much social stake in the game, when there's too much social value, is it becomes a social club with social drama, and then instead of being like a rest from the rest of the world, the church becomes just like the rest of the world, with people abusing their power, or people having silly social drama here and there, and that's of course really unhealthy for a church, for the house of God. So that's why I would caution against having the social aspect of the church be too important to the church itself. Now, I'm all for Christian fellowship in general, and all churches should have their own fellowship, but when community gets emphasized above ritual, that's when it becomes a problem. Because community for the sake of community doesn't really work, in my opinion. Like, it's sort of like, imagine if you had this sort of program where random people could come, and it's like, if someone's looking for a friend, we will assign you a friend, and the purpose is to make a friend. Usually, when you're looking for a friend for the purpose of having a friend, it doesn't really work that well. The way friendships and the way communities form is centered around a common interest. So that's why if a church is community-centered, then they're pursuing community for the sake of community. But if they're centered around ritual, around Christ, then the community will naturally form around that common interest. So that's why fellowship and community is good, but it must be in light of this common ritual. So ritual in church must come first. And it's like, I am so blessed that at college I have friends that I can go to church with. Because, I used to be the only one who went to the local Presbyterian church, but then I invited my friends, and by God's grace, they all came, and they all really liked the church. But I always have to ask myself, if these friends weren't there, would I still go to this church? Or would I go to a church that's not as good just because I have friends there? And I think when I first started out college, I was like, I need to go where my friends are going. But now I feel like that's not a good attitude to have, because going to church, it's not about me, and it's not about my social life. It's about worshiping God. So whichever local church worships God the best, in my opinion, I should go there. So, of course, if there's a good Presbyterian church, I should go to that. If there is none, in my case there is, but hypothetically, if there is none, go to whatever the next best thing is, like Lutheran or Anglican or Methodist. So, and of course, a non-super woke version of those, because all denominations have a woke version and a not woke version. A lot of times when all you hear of a certain denomination is a woke example of them, you'll think they're all woke. Like, I've heard this said about Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopals, Presbyterians, I don't know, all those groups. Someone says, hey, aren't those people super liberal? And I'm like, no, each one of those things has liberal and conservative congregations, but chances are the one thing you ran into was a liberal version. Like, I've heard people say, aren't Presbyterians liberal? Why? Because the Presbyterian church in my town has a gay flag. Okay, well, there are Lutheran churches like that too. There are Methodist churches like that too. And of course, all those churches wouldn't really be Presbyterian or Lutheran or Methodist. What they all are is just, liberal, which is its own religion altogether. Or at least theologically liberal. And that's its own religion. So yeah, my point is that community shouldn't be the end-all be-all in a church. If a church is really doing what it should be doing, community will form naturally. But it's like, there's a difference between my church at college and my church back home. So, in college, I go to college in Texas, and that means there are a lot of people my age who care about going to church. So I actually do have friends my age to go to church with. Back home, I have 0 friends to go to church with. I only really have one friend back home, my age that is, but I still have some sort of Christian fellowship at my church back home, even though I'm one of the only, young people, I'm one of the only people under the age of 80 who goes there. I still have some sort of fellowship across age groups. Of course, it's not the same. Of course, I wouldn't, go to Starbucks with these people. But, I do have fellowship with, some like old ladies. You know, it's like, so there's a difference between Christian fellowship and a social community, and we need to make that distinction. And one of the important reasons is I had this Christian friend. I've talked about her in the past. She's someone who used to be Christian, and she helped me become Christian, sort of, but then she fell to leftism and stopped being a Christian. And it was because she thought she didn't need to go to church. She could just still be a Christian by reading the Bible without going to church. And of course, you can't do that. No one can do that. Everyone needs to be hearing the Word of God ritualistically, being in the means of grace, receiving Word and Sacrament. You can't do Christianity solo. In most cases, I know there are people who become a Christian in like prison or whatever. But yeah, she said she didn't need to go to church. And her reasoning for that was she had bad experiences in church. And one of the churches she went to, it was just very cliquey, among the kids at least. I don't know about the adults. But this is a problem with some church youth groups that can become cliques. Now, my church never had a problem of a cliquey youth group because my church never had a youth group at all. We're in New York, and the only people who go are old people. So I'm not saying it's good for church. I think churches should have youth groups, but should caution against having them become like social clubs. So yeah, that's those are basically my thoughts on that. Why I would caution against having churches be so centered around community that they forget about other things, and that community becomes an idol. So yes, thanks for watching, and now I'm going to do whatever I do. I'm going to do this same thing I do in almost every episode, where I speed it up while I'm collecting stone. The reason I do this is because this is a big work. I'm building this all in survival mode, and in order to do that, I have to mine a lot of stone, but mining stone isn't very interesting, so whenever I do mine stone, I kind of want to speed that up. And that means I can work while I'm listening to something else. I usually listen to, like, Jordan Cooper or something. And, but I still want there to be video record of me actually doing all the work to make this huge church. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks. So now I'm going to speed this up while I do it.